Okay, hi everyone, welcome to my talk. My name is Maximilian, I'm working for Eclipse Source, and the title of my talk is EMF Forms goes AngularJS, also known as JSON Forms. Just first of all, how many of you are familiar with EMF? Okay, that's almost everyone. How many of you are familiar with EMF Forms? Okay, a lot less. Good. So the problem that we're trying to solve with EMF forms and with JSON forms, and I'm going to go into details what the relationship between the two of them is in a minute, but the problem that we're trying to solve is that in many applications you have data which is viewed or edited in a form-based UI, such as the UI we can see here. So you have fields for the different properties of an entity and you can enter data here, and at some later point you will submit the data from that form to a backend somewhere. For JSON forms or for EMF forms going AngularJS, we are talking about a web-based UI. This is an example here, and it's essentially the same. We have the different properties where we can fill in values and usually submit that to a server. How do we go about mapping the data to a UI? Usually, I have here an example. I have a UML class personal data and it has 5 properties. Usually the properties have a type and the type is influential on what I want to display in the form. So if I have a first name which is of type string, I want a text field here. Same goes for the last name, and I just map everything in here. If I have something that is an enumeration, I often have a drop down, for example, and if I have something like a date, I have a date picker. So the type of the property from the data model is influential on how to display it in the form, and the interesting part is which of the properties do we map onto the form, in which order and in which layout. That is the problem that we're trying to solve with EMF forms and JSON forms. And we're trying to solve that by modeling the UI. So the general idea is that you have what we call a domain model that models how your data looks like. In EMF forms, we use EMF for that, so you can have an XSD or an eCore describing how your data looks like. We add something that we call a view model. I'm going to go into detail what that exactly is, but basically it describes how you map the properties from the domain model onto a form-based UI. And what you want to get is a user interface. And the user interface is produced by a component that we refer to as a renderer. So a renderer takes as an input a description how your data looks like, a description how you want to produce a form, and it produces a user interface for that. Now, if we look at JSON forms, what the difference is the terminology. So the domain model becomes a JSON schema. JSON schema is a data modeling standard in the web. A JSON schema describes how a JSON looks like, how a JavaScript object looks like. And the view model becomes a UI schema. The UI schema still describes how to map properties onto forms. And of course, the result is a little bit different. It should be an AngularJS based web application, and the renderer in this case is an AngularJS renderer. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same. How does that relate to EMF forms? So we have seen that in EMF forms, we take the domain model as an eCore, we have the view model, which is another EMF model, and we receive a user interface. And for EMF forms, there's a bunch of different renderers that accomplish that. Most prominently, maybe the SWT renderer. Now in JSON forms, which we have down here, the domain model, as I said, relates to a JSON schema. So I can go both ways. I can take an eCore and make a JSON schema out of that, or take a JSON schema and make an eCore out of that. And same goes for the view model. I can take a view model and generate a UI schema from that, or I can take a UI schema and generate a view model. The approach that we have taken so far, that's also why the talk is EMF Forms goes AngularJS, we have created a JSON Forms exporter within EMF Forms. And this exporter will create from the domain model a JSON schema and from the view model a UI schema. And that is also what I'm going to demo today. So with that approach, you can easily just migrate from EMF forms to JSON forms, or it doesn't even have to be a migration. You can use it in parallel to have maybe an SWT-based form application and an AngularJS-based form application in the browser. Now in JSON forms, as I said, we also get the user interface by combining those two, and there is an AngularJS-based renderer. How many of you are in any way familiar with AngularJS? Okay, have you heard about it? Okay, more. So AngularJS is a framework that is mainly developed by Google. It's a web framework, and it realizes a so-called single-page app. So the idea is that you load a single HTML page, and from that point on, JavaScript navigates you through the application. It has most prominently a concept that is called a controller, and the controller basically controls how the UI loads data and which data is available in the UI. AngularJS is, you build native web applications with that, so you have HTML code, you have CSS, and you have JavaScript. What I'm going to demonstrate, and maybe that also shows how the AngularJS application works in that context, I'm going to demonstrate a conference registration system, and this is the data model of that system. In that system we have a registration, and the registration consists of personal data, which has a first name and a last name. It consists of nutrition information, which currently only has peanuts, which tells you whether you can eat peanuts or not. And it has payment data, which currently only consists of card number. This is the first iteration. I also want to show you how to enhance that data model at a later stage, have an SWT UI from that, that's like the default EMF way, EMF Forms way, and then also generate a JSON Forms based UI for that in the web browser. This is how the JSON Forms based UI is supposed to look like. So the idea is, it's so many fields, I want to have 3 tabs for that: general information, dietary requirements, and payment information, and then map the appropriate fields onto that. So first name, last name, and so on. What I should do now, but I can't do because I didn't trust the network, is the following 2 steps to get this started, because otherwise I start pretty much from scratch. There is an example UI project that you can get from GitHub. I just cloned that repository. And the second thing, that tool basically resolved all the dependencies and downloaded the dependencies into a local folder. So you can think of that as Maven. I downloaded from GitHub. It's the smallest possible increment of an AngularJS application. And the other plugin that I have in here is the conference model, the eCore model. And I've already modeled everything that you have seen in the diagram. So I have a registration here. The registration contains personal data, nutrition information, and payment data. The personal data consists of first name and last name. The nutrition information consists of peanuts, and payment data has the card number. By the way, this eCore editor that I'm using here is not the default one. It's an EMF Forms based eCore editor. Of course, we had to use our own stuff. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to generate the code from that. The model and the edit code. Now I get an additional plugin. If you're familiar with EMF, this additional plugin contains utility classes to visualize the model. So it adds icons, it adds labels, and all those kinds of things. So everything that we have right now is pure EMF. Now we're going to add the stuff that comes from EMF Forms. And what we need is a view model. And how to do that is you actually just select the eCore, and you have an entry EMF Forms create view model project. This will now create a view model project, and the first thing that I have to do is I have to define what the view model is for. And the view model is for viewing a registration. So I select that as an E-class, and I get my view model. Now I just noticed that I did a little mistake. I let the tooling already fill in the view model, which I don't want to do for the demo. But in general, there's functionality in there so that you get a pre-filled view model based on what is already in the E-class, so that you don't have to start from scratch. But for this demonstration, I think it is simpler if we start from scratch. And the first thing that I need is I need this tree-like structure. On the left-hand side, I wanted the 3 items, or in the web renderer on the top, the 3 tabs. So I have to define what the 3 tabs are. And this is what we call a categorization. So I'll add a categorization, and the categorization has leaf categories, and I'll have 3 leaf categories. And the first leaf category is going to be general information. The second leaf category is nutrition information, or I think I called it dietary requirements. And the third one is called payment data. Now in EMF Forms and in this view model editor, you can already get a preview how that would look like. In this case, how it would look like as an SWT. As an SWT application, and it would look like this. It would have the tree with the 3 categories, but whenever I select something in the category, there's no right-hand side because I didn't define any kind of form yet. So far, it's a pretty static structure. And to define what is being displayed, when I select general information, I can add a child in general information, and that would be a vertical layout in my case. A vertical layout is a layout where everything is one after another, just from top to bottom. And in the vertical layout, I add what we call a control. A control is an input field that displays something for a property. So it will be the label and the input field for the first name, or the label and the input field for the last name, or the date picker with the date of birth label in front. That is a control. And the most important part about a control is you need to tell the control what to display. I will first add a label here, first name, but this is only a label within the view model editor. It will not be used at runtime. To tell the control what it displays, it needs what we call domain model reference. So this is something that points into the domain model to a certain property. And in this case, this is a feature path domain model reference because it goes along a path of features in the EMF model. If you see that tree, I think it becomes more clear because first of all, I have to tell this domain model reference that I want to show something within personal data of a registration. And then within personal data, I need to tell it, now I want to display the first name. What I've done now is I have created this text field in here, and if I just reload my preview, I see that now I have one input field for the first name. It even has a validation on here already. That's why it's red. If I would enter something, it would go away because it was configured as a required field in the eCore that was picked up by the framework already without me configuring a lot. Since this is not very handy to add all those controls like this, there is a shortcut, generate controls. If you invoke this action, you can select what to generate controls for personal data in this case. And then you can select the properties that you want to generate a control for. You can even select that you only want to generate properties for things that are not already displayed in the view model. In my case, that is only last name. And it just generates the control in here. And if I would update my preview, I have an additional field in here. I will just repeat those steps for the other 2 categories. So I will add a vertical layout for the dietary requirements, generate the controls in there. It's only peanuts and finish, and the same for the payment data. Need a vertical layout, generate the controls. It's only the card number, and I finish. And if I would look at the preview, I have a UI as expected. Now, it has nothing to do with JSON forms so far, and we are not anywhere in the AngularJS domain. To get there, we can export the view model, and there's another action, export to JSON forms. If I invoke that, I can first of all select the location where I want to generate the JSON schema to. Remember, that's the data model, and I can wrap that in a JavaScript snippet already. And I want to generate that into the JSON form seed project, into the JS folder, and I will name it schema.js. And secondly, I have to select where to put the view model, that is the UI schema, and I will just put it into the same folder and name it, put it in the same folder and name it UI schema. JS. Also wrap it in JavaScript and finish. Okay. Now let's look at that JSON Forms example project. First of all, in the JSON Forms example project, there is an index HTML. Apart from a lot of setup code that is unfortunately necessary with JavaScript, just binds in all the different JavaScript snippets. It's very simple. There's a body here with a number of divs, but essentially the only interesting part is this tag here. This tag tells the JSON Forms framework that I want a form in here with a given schema, with a given UI schema, and with given data. We will look into the JavaScript code in a minute where those three actually come from, but in AngularJS these are variables. So there is supposed to be a schema variable on the scope, a UI schema variable on the scope, and a data variable on the scope. In addition, just for the purpose of demonstration, I also added just the text here, bound data, and in the curly brackets, this variable again. This will just automatically bind the data that we are editing so that you can see live what is the actually underlying data of the form, just for the demonstration purpose. So this is the HTML. The CSS I won't even go into. The other stuff here is just boilerplate. So the bar JSON is just a description of for bar which components we use. I already told you that I executed bar install. This is where it installed all the components to, basically downloaded it into a folder. You can think of that as the Maven repository. And then there's these artifacts in here. Custom control snippet is just for later, for demonstration. I generated the schema.js. If we look into that, this is just code. Basically, what this code does is it gets a service injected. AngularJS has the notion of injection, the schema service, and it creates that schema service, and this is basically a function. And the function will just always return the same schema, the same data schema. You could, of course, imagine that you want to return different schemas in different use cases. And the second snippet that we have generated is this UI schema snippet, and it just returns always the same generated UI schema. I mean, it's fairly readable if you look at that. Here's the category, it has a label. Here is defined what elements it displays, and here it references something from the data schema. It references the personal data first name property. It's very similar to what we have in EMF Forms. And finally, the app.js. That is the core part of an Angular application. There we define that we have a JSON Forms seed, that is an example's name, module, and we define a so-called controller. Every time you have an HTML snippet like that, you can, within a certain div, define that a certain JavaScript snippet is responsible for that block. And in my case, this is the my controller. In the controller, you can inject services, the two services that we've defined previously, and the scope. And now this is where things connect. So on the scope, I can set variables, UI schema, UI schema, and data. And if you go back to the tag, you can see here, These are the variables that are picked up in my HTML. This is the schema variable, the UI schema variable, and the data variable. And for the schema and UI schema, I just pull them from the service and just functions, and they return the string that has been generated. And for the data, I just pre-fill some JSON into that. And that's basically everything. The application is already runnable, and I can just open it up. So this is my form now. Remember up there, this is only for visualization, but you can see that there's already data in here. That is the pre-filled data, and as soon as I start entering something, you can see that it changes above here. So the data is already bound live to the JSON object, and if you would write an AngularJS application at some point, you would hit the submit button, you would take that JSON and send it back to the server, for instance. Yeah, well, the other parts, of course, work as well. And you could also see that there's even a validation on that. Good. So this was iteration 1 of changing the data model. Iteration 2, I'm going to go through a little faster. This just is supposed to show you that you can work iteratively and add stuff and add it to the view model later. So what I've added here is really a lot. I've added a bunch of properties here, here, and over there. I've refactored the nutrition information. I pulled out an additional class, food restrictions, with a bunch of properties, among them the peanuts that have previously been up here, and an additional attribute diet type. So this is more a full-blown conference model, pretty much everything you enter on the Eclipse Con webpage. And this is exactly what I'm going to do right now. This is the example we had. Let me just refresh the workspace for a second. Okay, and this is going to go really fast now. I'm opening up the eCore and I'm adding additional things. I'm going to use the keyboard combinations now to do it really fast. Most of the time I can hardly keep up with my voice. So this is a new attribute ID, which is an E string. And then I'm going to add a new attribute registration time to the conference, which is a date. And then I'm going to add an enumeration for the title, which has the values Mr., Mrs., Doctor, and Professor. And then I'm going to add another one for gender with female and male. And then let's add those two as attributes into the personal data. So I have the title attribute with the title enumeration and the gender attribute with the gender enumeration. Date of birth as an E-date, the diet as a carnivore, and so on. Actually, this is a script, of course. So we have the diet type with vegetarian and so on, and now we will add the food restrictions. So we have the peanuts in there, we have a lactose e-boolean, we have gluten e-boolean, and a pork e-boolean, and other as a string. And I'm going to add the diet and these restrictions into the nutrition information. And now for the payment data, we need the credit card type, which could be Visa, Master, or Amex. We need to add that as an attribute. We have the card holder as a string. We have the expiration month as an e-integer, the expiration year as an e-integer, and finally the CVV as an integer as well. That is the new eCore model. Let's just generate the code for that. And let's look into the view model that we already have. Now this view model shows some red areas, like here. So something is wrong with the view model now. Is there anyone who can guess what is wrong with the view model now? Nope. The problem is that the peanuts control is somehow wrong. The peanuts control, the domain model reference is not correct anymore. Because in the refactoring that I have done, I moved the peanuts property from the nutrition information down into food restrictions. And now it can't find that path anymore, and it tells me that. But I can just reselect another path. It's not in nutrition information, it's now in food restrictions, peanuts. Okay, view model fixed. What about the additional properties? We will just use the generate controls action that we have seen before. So I will generate controls for the personal data. I use this option only for unreferenced attributes because that will make it faster. Do the same for the dietary requirements. It's only one new field, the diet. Then I will add a group for all the restrictions to make it a little bit more clear how they belong together. Generate controls for all the food restrictions, only the not existing ones. And then finally for the payment information, generate the controls for everything that's not existing in here. That updated my view model to this pretty heavy second iteration. If I'll open up my preview, we have an updated form for everything. I've always shown that in the preview, but in fact it's of course also possible to just launch that as a standalone project, and it's actually pretty straightforward. If you would like to look at how to embed that on an SWT application, this is the code for that. This is a view, and actually this is all SWT setup to get a composite with some layout. This is a very sophisticated arrow handling, and this is the only interesting part in here. This calls to the SWT view renderer. That is part of EMF Forms and tells it to render something onto content, which is an SWT composite, and what to render, that is a dummy e-object. It's just a registration instance. This is everything you need to generate a form onto this content composite. And that composite could be everywhere, like on a property page, on a wizard, in some preferences, or on a view, or on an editor. In comparison to JSON forms, in JSON forms this would be the JSON forms tag that we've seen before. Let me just launch that to show you once. This is a product that contains the simple app that only shows this one entity as a standalone application, and it works with the validation and everything. Okay, now back to JSON forms. We can of course convert that back to JSON forms again and update our JavaScript application. So I'm going to export again. I have to browse to the JS folder, regenerate the schema.js, wrap it in the JavaScript. Same for the UI schema. And now I just go to the browser window that I already have, and I just hit refresh. And now we have a bunch of more properties and some bigger UI. Okay. Now, you see that there's a lot of different controls for the basic types, for strings and dates and so on. But more often than not, at some point in time, for the last 5% of an application, you will need to customize one of the renderers that we have, either because of some additional behavior that you would like to have, or because you even reinvent a new type of view model element or a new type of UI schema element, something that is not there before. I don't know, a grid layout maybe. I mean, there is a grid layout, but let's imagine there was no grid layout. You would have to define that new element, and then you would have to define a renderer which is responsible for rendering this one element. I've talked about the AngularJS renderer. In fact, it's more a renderer factory, and it consists of many renderers for the different types of UI schema elements. One renderer for text boxes, one renderer for integer properties, one renderer for a horizontal layout, one renderer for a vertical layout. And adding a new control is pretty straightforward. That is why I have the snippet in here. We'll just copy it over to the app.js and look at it. This adds a new control with a given priority of 100. A renderer has to say when it wants to be responsible for rendering something. It only wants to be responsible if it is a control that is to be rendered, and if the schema path is well defined and it contains a first name. So in other words, this is a renderer only responsible for first name properties, which, just for the sake of example, was simple to do. And a control basically has to return a template string. This is an HTML template string which defines an input text field. And basically only changes the color. The color will be blue now. If I just save that and I go back to my browser and I reload, now this field is blue. Because now, instead of the default renderer, we have another renderer with a higher priority of 100. It kicks in and it will just render this one part of the HTML. When to use that approach? Let me just quickly step through that. Of course, this is not an approach you should use if you only have 2 fields on a form. I mean, that can be done simpler. It is especially helpful if you have a large domain model that you need to put onto UI, or if you have many different views, even for a small UI model, maybe for different stakeholders or different permissions. If you have frequent if you have frequent domain model changes, we've seen that with the 2 iterations, you can simply update the view model. The view model even helps you to identify which of the properties have not been put onto the view, which of the properties are not valid anymore because you are referring with a field to a property that is not existing anymore. You get a very homogeneous UI because you have renderers, and those renderers can just follow your UI guidelines, and they're used all over the place. And you get something that we have discussed all over the place now. You get some kind of UI technology independence, at least for your forms, because your forms can now be rendered onto different platforms. And from my practical experience, you get an improved customer involvement because you can show prototypes of UI very early on, and you can iterate on those very easily. More information on that, there's a website on JSONForms. JSONForms is currently hosted on GitHub. There's an excellent getting started tutorial, and there's also a guide how to migrate from EMFForms to JSONForms. Of course, there's also the EMFForms website to get information about EMFForms with a good getting started tutorial. And if you're interested in that stuff, this is an early beta from my point of view. We already use it and it works quite well, but I would say for a limited set of view model elements, for example. And if you're interested in that, you can follow our updates on JSONForms. We are heavily working on that, and we will push this forward. Thank you very much. Of course, this slide is obligatory. Please vote for the sessions, also for this session. Thank you very much. I think we have only a very little time for questions. Are there any questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question since you have created most of the controls, like the default controls are already there.
Yep.
For instance, the table control.
Yep.
But is there any feature which I can override the default control rather than re-implementing the whole control?
Yeah. That was what I showed here. This is overriding the default control for a text control here with a slightly variant, only with a different background, but it could be an entirely different HTML snippet which does something very different. So it's explicitly, we explicitly foresee that you will want to override renderers for specific parts of the forms.
Support for calculated fields?
Sorry?
For calculated, not from the model, but derived by some calculation or concatenation.
The way you can do that is you add a custom renderer for that field, and you can add a JavaScript snippet which does the calculation, pulls out the value from somewhere else. I guess you want to do it locally in the browser, not remotely, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's the way you could do it. One more I think we can take. Yeah. It is supported by EMF Forms, and we are working on it to get it also into JSON Forms because it's a very frequent use case, but not yet there. So in JSON Forms, not supported yet. But it's an obvious next one. Thanks.
How easy is it to extend EMF Forms to add a new control?
It's pretty simple. You mean an entirely new control as well. What I've shown is just replacing the renderer. You can also invent new view model elements, and that's also something we explicitly foresee. All the view model elements you see in here, they're not in some kind of privileged core, they're all extensions. So it is pretty straightforward to define a new type of element, like I said, a grid layout if something like that wasn't there, and then also add renderers to that. If you want it on both sides, you add an SWT renderer and an AngularJS renderer, and you have it. Okay, thanks guys, thank you very much.